Welcome to the Infinite Women podcast. I'm your host, Allison Tyra, and today I'm joined by Lydia Reeder, author of The Cure for Women, Dr. Mary Putnam Jacobi, and the Challenge to Victorian Medicine that changed women's lives forever. So that's a pretty bold title. Can you give us a bit of an introduction to Dr. Jacobi?
Mary Putnam was born in London in 1842, but she grew up in New York City. Her father was the publishing entrepreneur George Palmer Putnam. She was the eldest of 11 children, and her household was always bustling. I don't think it was ever quiet. But growing up, Mary had a wonderful sense of self confidence and could charm her way through any situation. She was always the cleverest person in the room. And even though her family nicknamed her Minnie because of her tiny size, she once wrote that her view of the world was as tall, wide, and clear as if she were gazing from a mountaintop. So from a young age, Mary was very curious about many things, but also about science and biology. At age 9, she discovered a recently deceased rat in the family barn and asked her mother if she could slice open the abdomen and observe, its heart and its lungs and its stomach contents. Her mother was so disgusted that she forbade her to touch, you know, rats carried diseases back then. But fortunately, Mary also loved to write and tell stories, and it was good because she lived in a publishing household. Her parents did encourage her vivid imagination, and she was sent to all the best schools. Also, the evenings in the Putnam household were spent entertaining professors and ministers and scientists and authors, including Edgar Allan Poe, Washington Irving, and even Elizabeth Barrett Browning when she visited. Mary, at age 10, one time put a sign on the front door right before one of these meetings and that read, "Nobody admitted who cannot talk." In 1854, when Mary was 12 years old, her father published Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell's first book. That book was called The Laws of Life, and he published it because he liked her ideas about hygiene and public health. Elizabeth Blackwell was the first woman in America to graduate from regular medical school. She wanted to become a doctor in order to provide sick women the option of seeing a woman doctor. But at the time, women were barred from attending all medical schools. And when Blackwell was accepted, it was kind of thought of as a joke. But they had to admit her, and she ended up graduating at the top of her class. Mary Putnam's father, like most Victorian men, considered the practice of medicine to be an improper profession for ladies. He wanted Mary to become a teacher or a writer because, unlike the so-called spinster Dr. Blackwell, many women who were teachers and writers also got married and had kids. Mr. Putnam feared that if Mary became a doctor, which was considered back then to be a highly masculine profession, her femininity would harden, her ability to have children would diminish, and she would never be able to have children. Even so, her parents admired and loved their gifted daughter. And so they let her, when she turned 17, gain medical experience by working for Elizabeth Blackwell at her New York Infirmary for Women and Children. And that's when Mary fell in love with science. When she looked through a microscope for the first time at human cells, the whole world seemed to open up to her. And at age 21, she became the first woman in America to earn a degree in pharmacy when she graduated from the New York College of Pharmacy. Then in 1864, she earned her Doctor of Medicine from the Female Medical College of Pennsylvania, which was the first fully accredited women's medical college in America. But even then, after she had these two degrees, she still wasn't satisfied with the extent of her knowledge. She wanted to be the best. So she set her sights on the finest medical school in the world at the Sorbonne in Paris, despite the fact that the institution had never accepted women in the 600 years it had existed. In fact, Elizabeth Blackwell told her that she'd only be able to get into one clinic in Paris, and that was the one for obstetrics, which all the women back then were admitted to. But after Mary arrived in Paris, and after Elizabeth Blackwell helped her find work in in that hospital clinic, Mary used her growing access to more and more clinics and hospitals to become the Paris correspondent for the medical record, which was a highly respected American medical journal. But she had to disguise her gender by signing her articles PCM, which were the opposite of her actual initials. But she ended up working in some of the finest laboratories in Paris, and for some of the greatest research scientists in the world. And it was interesting because she was so intelligent and yet so small and so feminine. Instructors began competing to see who could obtain the next connection for Mary to gain admittance to some clinic. The more clinics she got into, the more chance she had for being admitted to the medical school. She was the first woman, perhaps in France, where professors fell in love with her intelligence. It was interesting. She made them want to teach her. And I found that to be an unequaled achievement for a woman back then. So it took 2 years of brilliant clinic work and clever networking, but Mary Putnam became the first woman accepted into the Paris Medical School in 1868. And she even endured the 1870 siege of Paris by the Prussians in their war with France in order to continue her studies and graduate. But she finally graduated from that medical school in 1871.
And coming back to the challenge to Victorian medicine that changed women's lives forever, what did she do that's still impacting women's health today?
Well, actually, a lot. After she graduated from the Paris Medical School, it made her one of the best educated, even physicians, definitely in America, possibly in the world, with her 3 degrees. And her clinical studies in the medical laboratories in Paris were unsurpassed. So when she returned to America, she brought research science to medicine in the form of evidence-based practice. In fact, an article published in the Lancet Medical Journal in 2021 credited Mary Putnam Jacobi to be one of the most remarkable minds of 19th century medicine. Before her time, medicine was based on pathologies and the doctor's assessment rather than laboratory research and data. There was no laboratory research, no blood tests, no urine samples. In fact, right around the time she got back to America, thermometers were being introduced, and a lot of doctors considered them newfangled machines that shouldn't be trusted. So it was a turning point, and that was one of the ways she changed lives. But when Mary returned to New York, she became professor of materia medica at Elizabeth Blackwell's Medical School for Women in New York City. So she organized the Association for the Advancement of the Medical Education of Women. and tirelessly advocated for women's acceptance into regular medical schools like Harvard. She feared that even though women's medical schools were accredited and had the most up-to-date science and courses, she feared that as time went on, they just wouldn't be funded like the men's medical schools were. And then in 1873, she married Abraham Jacobi. And at the time, he was 12 years older than she was, and he was a highly respected children's physician and became known as the father of pediatric medicine. By this time, 1873, there were almost 2,500 women practicing medicine in America. There were women-run hospitals and medical schools in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, and even San Francisco.
So when you say 2,500, I assume that was just the doctors, not women, who may have been practicing medicine as nurses, midwives, or others.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, correct. There were many more nurses, amazingly. The Civil War changed that because men were only supposed to be nurses before the Civil War, and then right after the Civil War, women were nurses, and then it became a women's
All right.
job.
That's a whole other, we can have a whole
Yeah.
other conversation about that.
And I talk about that, at the beginning of my book, because that's how women decided to become doctors. They had to force their way in. But by this time, they had become really successful. Elizabeth Blackwell and certainly Mary Putnam Jacobi and all the women-run medical institutions that were attracting women patients at a greater and greater number. So at this time, there occurred a furious backlash from many of the elite male physicians who were considered the experts of their day on women's health. And these physicians included Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who was the dean of Harvard Medical School at the time. There was the wonderful Dr. Horatio Storer, who was the AMA vice president and leader of the Physicians' Crusade against abortion, and S. Ware Mitchell, the famous Philadelphia neurologist and the inventor of the rest cure for women. These doctors and many others claim that women were unfit for any profession besides teaching and nursing, and should avoid higher education at all costs. These so-called, medical experts published what they termed scientific papers claiming, without any data, that women were biologically incapable of higher education because their menstrual cycles made them perpetually sick and emotionally unbalanced.
They do love blaming menstruation, don't they?
Still. Yes, and it really all started here. The pseudoscience, and especially with this one, the most impactful assault on women's higher education was an essay titled "Sex in Education or a Fair Chance for the Girls," published in 1873 by Dr. Edward Clark, who was also a Harvard professor. And they were kind of into the pre-eugenics phase when all this happened. So he drew his information from the works of Charles Darwin, and then there was Herbert Spencer, who was kind of the father of eugenics, and then S. Ware Mitchell. And Clark proclaimed that scientific evidence confirmed the dire state of women's health, that they were completely pathological. And this view was widely accepted, with Clark's essay becoming an international bestseller. He wrote, "To save the health of American girls, he recommended that girls and boys should never be educated together, and that girls should study less than 4 hours per day and rest every fourth week to accommodate their menstrual cycles, all under the supervision of their physicians." He neglected to say anything about the teachers, who were all women, but the female students should always rest 1 week out of the month. Clark wrote that if females performed too much brain work, they would devolve into a third gender called a gene, Agene, similar to what he called the sexless class of termites. He related it all to kind of a warped vision of evolutionary progress. Anyway, Clark's book was an international bestseller. Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote an essay published in the Atlantic magazine in which he declared that in this fight to pacify the females so that they would calmly and happily get married and reproduce, Clark was akin to Abraham Lincoln, leading the learned white men into a battle that they must win. As a
Wow.
result, yeah, it was a PR deluge to get women, out of the classrooms, and definitely out of higher education and the medical schools.
It always strikes me how hard the misogynists have to work to keep women out while simultaneously claiming that women aren't capable. Like, if women weren't capable, you wouldn't need to put in all this effort.
Well, have you read Project 2025?
Oh God. Oh no, we're not going there. Oh Jesus.
Well,
I mean,
to me, I see
I
that
mean,
as a
I've read more of it than the people who voted for him, apparently.
I guess. But I
Jesus.
see that absolutely as a continuation of this freak out over women's progress and the desire to kind of like put them back, into the out of the limelight, back into the kitchens where they belong. And now it's certainly pathological on their part to try and do that. It's just crazy. There's a backlash against anybody who makes progress against, the status quo. And we are in that phase.
The name of his treatise, because I've heard of it before, and it just like it
Mhm.
sounds like it's pro women.
No, and he actually thought he was doing women a favor.
Oh God.
These guys think that they're going to be welcomed with open arms by the feminists. I have the solution for you. We're going to solve all of women's problems, and here it is. And they can still be educated, but only, half as much as men. And it was just, I think they were kind of surprised at the time. The feminists hated it. They hated it. And so did some of the professors. Basically, all of Edward Clark's proof that women's brains couldn't tolerate a lot of work and a lot of education was just his own personal experiences with women in his medical practice. And so some of the professors at Harvard Medical School weren't happy with Clark's essay. And it's pretty much a dire lack of scientific research. It was kind of just all popular talk, popular essay. So at Harvard, each year there was a prestigious Harvard Boylston Medical Society, which was made up of all of Boston's top physicians, and they devised special essay topics for their annual medical prize. All essays were submitted and judged anonymously. And at the close of 1874, not long after Clark had published his book, the committee proposed an essay question for 1876, which would give people 2 years in advance to allow for enough time for research. And the question was, do women require mental and bodily rest during menstruation, and to what extent? And this topic excited the women's rights activists who hated Clark's book. And these were activists like Julia Ward Howe and Lucy Stone and an educator, C. Alice Baker. They understood that if science proved that women were biologically incapable of complex thinking, then why should women be allowed to vote? So they needed their own elite medical scientists to win the Boylston Prize and to prove Clark wrong. And at the time, only one such person existed, and that was Mary Putnam Jacobi. Mary had already proven herself by graduating from Paris Medical School to be more intelligent than most men. So they believed that she could win because it was judged anonymously. Um, However, at the time, Mary was pregnant with her first child. And so she couldn't start her research until many months later. And by that time, she didn't have a lot of time to get it done. So she had to join forces with the vast network of the women's rights movement. And to do that, she devised a very unique way to gather information that had never been used in scientific research. She sent out a questionnaire. The women's rights volunteers helped copy and distribute the survey, and then they collected the responses from hundreds of women from all walks of life. They were rich and poor. They lived in the rural areas. They lived in urban areas. Um, in addition, Mary carried out experiments with the help of her colleagues in the New York Infirmary for the women and children. She also did something unheard of in medical research. Never before had it been done. She wanted to map the physiological and chemical signs of menstruation related to physical changes in women's bodies throughout their monthly cycles. Uh, she did blood work. She had them get on exercise machines. She noted how body temperatures change throughout their cycles. In fact, her breakthrough led to the discovery that these temperature changes indicated ovulation and eventually led to a form of natural family planning and birth known as the rhythm method. Her groundbreaking essay that she wrote about her research was titled The Question of Rest During Menstruation, and her essay would win her the Boylston Prize in 1876, making her the first woman to ever win that award. And it was truly a landmark moment for women in medicine and a significant step forward for in challenging the flawed yet widely held beliefs about women's reproductive biology.
You mentioned that she did get married and she was actually pregnant when they came to her and were like, "Hey, we need you to revolutionize women's medicine." So
Yeah.
clearly her dad was wrong about the whole if you go to med school, it'll make you infertile thing.
Oh, Mary Putnam Jacobi, she loved kids. As an older sister, she was fantastic. All of them loved her. They loved the stories she would tell when she would get back from all of her adventures. But she was everywhere. During the Civil War, she went down to visit her brother in New Orleans right when the South was attacking New Orleans. So she was there in that battle. And then she was in Paris during when the Prussians attacked. And she led a very, very interesting life. And it was very adventurous and she loved it.
I just find it really interesting because, I mean, her dad wasn't wrong in the sense that a lot of these women did choose not to marry for various reasons, whether it was their career, some of them almost certainly were queer.
Yes.
If they had a career, they didn't need to depend financially on a man. A lot of them were from well-off families anyway. So he wasn't wrong in the sense that a lot of these women did choose to stay single for various reasons. So I would say, like, at least from what I've seen, I would guess she was actually more of an outlier, like being able to have a family and balance that with what she was doing.
She was an outlier, and some of the feminists, in fact, resented her for getting married, and she would talk about her sex life with other people, which kind of turned some people off, and others it was quite interesting. And Abraham Jacobi, despite the fact that later on he didn't approve of her becoming a famous doctor, they were both very progressive in the way they practiced medicine, and they were both very much into contraception. And that was illegal then because of all the crusades going on to make women have babies. But she was very open about having a good sex life and that women needed to have sex and all of that. So it was very interesting how she worked the idea of marriage into her practice. I have an idea that she was quite open with her patients in the way she discussed these things. But I think a lot of, especially women doctors back then, didn't get married because at the time, but it was getting better slowly during the second part of the 19th century. But women, when they got married, they lost all of their individuality. They had to give all of their money that they made to their husbands. They couldn't own property. It was kind of a negative to get married.
Well, and you mentioned that her husband was like initially they were on the same page, but
Yes.
that didn't last, shall we say.
No, not after they had two children. He developed other male friendships and they kind of lost their camaraderie over medicine. And there was one point where they had a huge disagreement over it, and Mary walked out of the house saying, I mean, they had a nanny. They were very extremely wealthy, so why would she have to stay home? It was just, I think he was beginning to feel the pressure. Women's rights were becoming a hotbed back then, and he was probably starting to feel some of the pressure from his other friends because Mary was more famous than he was by this time. But he was quite a well-known doctor in his own right. Her wonderful marriage kind of began to fall apart, and it was kind of sad. But her eyes opened, and while she was not a suffrage advocate in her 30s, toward the end of the 19th century, she was one of she was on the forefront of advocating for women's suffrage. So it was very interesting.
Well, and I think there's always a clear connection, including today, between women's health and their control over their own health and our understanding of women's health and women's rights. Like, I think women's health can arguably be considered the most fundamental right that women should have and often don't.
Having control over your own body and over your own health is one of the biggest struggles of any time, and still today we're having that struggle. But back then, Elizabeth Blackwell became a doctor so that women could have other women as doctors. Mary Putnam Jacobi worked her entire life getting other women into medicine and getting them allowed into the regular hospital clinic so they could gain experience and become research scientists and medical scientists in their own right. And she knew that politics and science were one and the same. That science would somehow she believed that science would set women free. And in a way, that's true. The more they discover about biology and sex and gender. And that's why I think today you're seeing such a tremendous backlash against science because it's evening the playing field everywhere. Those in charge don't want that.
And I will say that even before the current state of affairs in the US, we still were nowhere near gender parity when it comes to medical research and treatment. So
No, not at
fortunately,
all.
unfortunately, I think we are past the stage where they could get away with just not studying women, or anyone who wasn't a cisgender man. But even then, conditions like endometriosis or polycystic ovary syndrome, which I have PCOS, it affects an estimated 6 to 13% of reproductive aged people with ovaries. But up to 70% of affected people remain undiagnosed worldwide. I hadn't even heard of it until I was diagnosed with it.
Hmm.
And we also have situations where, like, things like pregnancy, menopause, dysmenorrhea, a lot of doctors still treat that as it's not a disease per se. So they act like these symptoms don't need to be treated because they're natural.
Yeah.
So there's
Well,
just so much, so much.
the same way, with the symptoms of menopause, but just to tell you how much things have not changed since Mary Putnam Jacobi. A friend of mine went to the emergency room since she giving birth to her child. She had had horrible, horrible migraine headaches. And finally, it had gotten so bad. After a few years, she said, "Okay, I'm going to the emergency room." So she went to the emergency room for pain meds. And she asked the doctor there, she said, "So, do you think maybe the hormone changes of me giving birth have caused these migraines?" And his response was, "Well, of course, all women's illnesses are caused by their reproductive system." And she told me that, and I just laughed. And I said, "That's something that a doctor would have told a woman 150 years ago."
Please tell me
Uh,
she changed doctors.
well, it was the doctor in the emergency room.
Okay.
So he wasn't her doctor, but
I
she
would have
was.
demanded a different doctor on the spot.
I would have too. I mean, I get migraine headaches, but that's because I have a weird nut allergy. It has nothing to do with my reproductive system. Mary Putnam Jacobi, after her study on menstruation, kind of went into neurology and was very interested in the brain and gender, and even studied what was termed back then, which is not a proper term today, hermaphrodites, and wrote lengthy essays about gender and how there was no clear divisions of gender, that a lot of men were very feminine, a lot of women were very masculine. Where are these black and white divisions that you say occur? Of course, she was doing it because men were saying that women had smaller brains and couldn't think. They had smaller brains, so they were evolutionarily behind men, which wasn't true at all. But she really, really probably would love the gender studies today and get totally involved in that, because there is no solid line or division in that. And it was clear even to her back then.
Well, and it's also things where, brain size is not a direct indicator of intelligence, but even things like IQ tests, all of these
No.
tests that were designed with bias by biased people, even
Hmm.
if they weren't consciously aware of it. Like, it's baked in. So saying, "Oh, but, women score lower on this test or that test," I always ask, who designed the test?
Right. Right. They were designed specifically, really, until the passage of Title IX, nothing was ever thought to be equalized among racial disparities, sex and gender, and all of that. Title IX was kind of the miracle cure for that, looking back on it. Women weren't accepted to medical schools. I think 5% of the people accepted to medical schools before Title IX were women, even though they represented about 50% of the applicants. But after that, women in medical schools exploded, and it's just been gaining ever since. So yeah, it all depends on who's doing the hiring, who's doing the designing, and we're kind of changing that, hopefully.
So obviously she is amazing. But as you mentioned, there's other women who were also being badasses at the time. So,
Hmm.
what was it about Mary Putnam Jacobi specifically that made you say, I've got to write a whole book about her?
I was reading her actual writing, and then she had a lot of wrote a lot of letters, and to me, she was just back then a force of nature. And she was out front in the battles against, the pseudoscience claiming that all of women's ills were caused by their uterus. But also at the same time, she was like a modern woman. She kind of wanted it all. She wanted a husband who loved her. She wanted adorable kids. And it just seemed like nothing could hold her back. She was on the forefront of so many things. I was astonished to find that she was credited with introducing scientific, research based medicine to American physicians, which basically changed the course of American medicine. So she was a much bigger, brighter character in the medical field back then than she's been given credit for. Her accomplishments also empowered other women to follow in her footsteps. She mentored young women physicians, taught them how to organize and network and fight for justice. She was a suffragist, an activist, and a powerful proponent of women's rights. Her writing was easy to read, even though it was clinical. And I think that's what helped make her a famous doctor during her time. She really knew how to communicate medicine to regular people. And when something new came out, like bacteria came out, well, they would come to her and say, ask her to write about it. So she would be writing about all the new experiments. Whereas her husband, Abraham, was so against the idea of bacteria and microscopes, he called it bacteria mania, and hated the idea of physicians being in the laboratory all the time. So that's another place where they had their differences. Oh, and Mary Putnam Jacobi helped organize what would become the League of Women Voters. But most importantly, her study of menstruation really led to the beginning of a paradigm change in women's lives. Before then, women were not considered individuals. So the paradigm change when women were considered individuals who had a right to be educated and a right to choose their own happiness. And before her time, it just wasn't considered. And I think she helped bring about that change.
Join us next time on the Infinite Women podcast, and remember, well behaved women rarely make history.